In our previous video, we saw how God rejected Saul as king, and chose a young shepherd boy named David. Though David was the youngest and smallest of Jesse's sons, God saw something in his heart that others could not. Samuel anointed David in secret, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him from that day forward. Meanwhile, Saul began to be troubled by an evil spirit, and God used David's harp playing to bring him peace, bringing the future king into the presence of the current one. Now, as we continue the story in 1 Samuel chapters 17 to 31, everything begins to change. David steps into the spotlight as he faces a terrifying giant named Goliath. His courage and faith spark jealousy in Saul, leading to a long and painful journey of hiding, betrayal, friendship, and war. From the battlefield to the wilderness, we'll witness David's rise and Saul's tragic downfall. These chapters are filled with drama, emotion, and powerful moments that remind us of God's plan unfolding, even in the darkest times. The Philistine army gathered for battle at a place called Shochoh in Judah, setting up camp between Shochoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelite army positioned themselves across the valley of Elah, with each side standing on a mountain, separated by a valley. Then a warrior from the Philistine camp stepped forward. His name was Goliath, from Gath, and he was a giant, over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet and heavy armor weighing over 100 pounds, with bronze protection on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. His spear was thick like a weaver's beam, and its iron tip alone weighed about 15 pounds. He had a shield bearer walking in front of him. Goliath shouted to the Israelite army, challenging them to send one man to fight him. He said if their man could kill him, the Philistines would become Israel's servants, but if he won, then Israel would serve the Philistines. He mocked and defied the armies of Israel, and when Saul and his men heard his words, they were terrified. Meanwhile, David, the youngest son of Jesse from Bethlehem, was not in the army. His 3 oldest brothers had gone to fight with Saul. David went back and forth between tending his father's sheep and visiting the battlefield. Goliath came out every morning and evening for 40 days, repeating his challenge. One day, Jesse asked David to take food to his brothers and check on them. David rose early, left the sheep with a caretaker, and went to the camp as instructed. As he arrived, the army was going out to the battlefield with shouts. David left the supplies with the keeper and ran to greet his brothers. While he was talking to them, Goliath came out again, repeating his challenge, and David heard him. The Israelites fled in fear at the sight of Goliath. Some men said that whoever killed Goliath would be richly rewarded by the king, including marrying his daughter and receiving tax exemption for his family. David asked what reward would be given to the man who defeated Goliath, and questioned how this uncircumcised Philistine could insult the army of the living God. His oldest brother, Eliab, got angry and accused David of pride and coming just to watch the battle. But David defended himself, saying he had a reason to speak. Word of David's question reached Saul, and he sent for him. David told Saul not to be afraid, that he would fight Goliath. Saul said David was too young and inexperienced, but David shared how he had fought off lions and bears while caring for his father's sheep. He said, God had saved him from those animals, and he would also save him from Goliath. Saul agreed and said, "May the Lord be with you." He gave David his own armor, but David wasn't used to it and took it off. Instead, David took his staff, chose 5 smooth stones from a brook, and with his sling in hand, approached Goliath. As Goliath came closer, he looked at David and mocked him for being just a young boy. He cursed David by his gods and threatened to feed him to the birds and wild animals. But David boldly replied that while Goliath came with sword, spear, and shield, he came in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel whom Goliath had defied. David declared that the Lord would deliver Goliath into his hands, and that the whole world would know there was a God in Israel. As Goliath moved in to attack, David ran toward him. He took a stone, placed it in his sling, and hurled it. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead, sank in, and the giant fell face down to the ground. David had no sword, but he ran to Goliath, took the Philistine's own sword, and used it to kill him and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they ran away. The Israelites shouted and chased them, killing many along the road to Gath and Ekron. Afterward, the Israelites returned and plundered the enemy camp. David took Goliath's head to Jerusalem but kept his armor. When Saul saw David go out to face Goliath, he asked his commander Abner who the young man was. Abner said he didn't know. After the victory, David was brought before Saul, still holding Goliath's head. Saul asked him who his father was, and David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, from Bethlehem." After David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan, Saul's son, felt a deep bond with David and loved him like his own soul. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and didn't allow him to return home. Jonathan and David made a covenant because of their strong friendship. Jonathan even took off his royal robe and gave it to David, along with his armor, sword, bow, and belt, showing his deep respect and loyalty. David continued to serve faithfully and wisely wherever Saul sent him, and Saul placed him over the soldiers. Everyone respected David, including Saul's own officials. As David returned from defeating the Philistine giant, women came out from all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing with joy. They celebrated Saul, but they praised David even more, singing, "Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. This made Saul very angry and jealous. He thought, "They credit David with 10,000s and me with only thousands. What more can he take but the kingdom?" From then on, Saul kept a close and suspicious eye on David. The next day, Saul was disturbed again by an evil spirit from God. As David played the harp to soothe him, Saul held a spear in his hand. Suddenly, Saul hurled the spear at David, trying to pin him to the wall, but David escaped twice. Saul became more afraid of David because he could see that the Lord was with him, but had left Saul. So, Saul made David a commander over 1,000 men, hoping to keep him away. Yet David continued to behave wisely, and the Lord remained with him. This only made Saul more fearful. Meanwhile, all of Israel and Judah loved David, because he led them well in battle and daily life. Trying another tactic, Saul offered his eldest daughter Merab to David, in marriage, saying he wanted David to be courageous and fight the Lord's battles. But in his heart, Saul hoped the Philistines would kill David. David humbly replied that he wasn't worthy to be the king's son-in-law. But when the time came, Saul gave Merab to another man named Adriel. Later, Saul found out that his younger daughter Michal loved David, and this pleased him because he saw another chance to trap David. He said he would let David marry Michal, thinking she might be a snare to him. Saul secretly instructed his servants to convince David that the king and his servants truly liked him, and wanted him to become the king's son-in-law. David replied modestly, saying it seemed too great an honor for someone poor and unimportant like him. When Saul heard David's response, he said that the only dowry he wanted was 100 Philistine foreskins as revenge against their enemies. But in truth, Saul hoped David would be killed trying to earn this bride price. David agreed to it and went out with his men. Instead of 100, they killed 200 Philistines and brought back proof. David presented it to Saul, who then gave Michal to David as his wife. Saul clearly saw that the Lord was with David and that even his own daughter loved him. This made Saul even more afraid and confirmed David as his enemy from that point on. Still, every time the Philistine leaders came out to battle, David acted with more wisdom than all of Saul's other officials, and his name became well known and greatly respected across the land. Saul told his son Jonathan and all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan cared deeply for David, so he warned him, saying, "My father wants to kill you. Please be careful. Hide in a secret place until morning, and I'll talk to my father about you. I'll let you know what he says." Jonathan then spoke well of David to Saul and tried to change his mind. He reminded Saul that David hadn't done anything wrong and had actually helped him greatly. Jonathan said, "He risked his life to kill the Philistine giant, and God brought a great victory for all of Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. So why would you now sin by killing an innocent man who has done nothing to deserve it?" Saul listened to Jonathan and made a promise, saying, "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed." Then Jonathan called David and told him everything. He brought David back to Saul, and things seemed to return to normal for a while. Later, when war broke out again, David went out to fight and defeated the Philistines with a great victory, making them flee. But once again, an evil spirit came upon Saul while he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. David was playing music to calm him, but Saul tried to throw the spear at him and pin him to the wall. David escaped just in time and ran away that night. Saul then sent messengers to watch David's house and planned to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, "If you don't escape tonight, you'll be killed tomorrow." She helped him escape through a window, and he fled. To trick the men watching, Michal took a household idol, laid it in the bed, put a pillow made of goat's hair at the head, and covered it with a blanket. When Saul's messengers came, she told them David was sick. Saul sent them back and ordered, "Bring him to me in his bed so I can kill him." But when they came back and looked closely, they realized it was only an image in the bed. Saul asked Michal, "Why did you trick me and let my enemy get away?" Michal answered, "He said to me, 'Let me go, or I'll kill you.'" David ran and escaped to Samuel at Ramah. He told Samuel everything Saul had done, and they both went to stay in a place called Naioth. When Saul heard that David was in Naioth, he sent messengers to capture him. But when they got there and saw a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel leading them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers, and they started prophesying too. Saul sent more messengers 2 more times, but the same thing happened, they all began to prophesy. Finally, Saul himself went to Ramah. On his way, he asked where Samuel and David were, and someone told him they were at Naioth. As he approached, the Spirit of God came upon him as well, and he started prophesying all the way to Naioth. When he got there, he even took off his clothes and lay on the ground, prophesying before Samuel all day and night. Because of this unusual event, people began saying, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" David was deeply troubled, escaped from Naioth and went to Jonathan. He asked, "What have I done wrong? Why is your father trying to kill me?" Jonathan didn't believe it and said, "No, you won't die. My father tells me everything, big or small, and he hasn't said anything about this." But David insisted, saying, "Your father knows we are close friends. He's keeping it from you because he doesn't want to upset you. But I swear, there's just one step between me and death." Jonathan replied, "Whatever you need me to do, I will do it." David said, "Tomorrow is the new moon feast, and I'm supposed to eat with the king. Let me hide in the field until the evening of the 3rd day. If your father notices I'm missing, say I asked to go to Bethlehem for our family's yearly sacrifice. If he says, 'That's fine,' then I'm safe. But if he gets angry, you'll know he plans to harm me." David added, "Please be kind to me, because we've made a covenant before the Lord. But if I've done anything wrong, kill me yourself. Don't hand me over to your father." Jonathan said, "Never. If I knew my father planned to harm you, I'd tell you." David then asked, "But how will I know what your father says?" Jonathan replied, "Let's go out to the field and talk." So they both went into the field. There, Jonathan made a promise before God and said, "If I find out my father wants to help you and I don't let you know, may the Lord punish me. But if he plans to harm you, I'll warn you so you can escape in peace. And may the Lord be with you as he was with my father." Jonathan asked David to promise that he would always be kind to his family, even after the Lord had removed all his enemies. They made a covenant, and Jonathan had David swear again, because he loved him deeply. Jonathan then explained the plan. He said, "Tomorrow, when your seat is empty, people will notice. On the third day, go to the place where you hid before, and wait near the stone called Ezel. I'll shoot 3 arrows nearby, as if I'm practicing. I'll send a boy to retrieve them. If I say, 'The arrows are on this side,' then you're safe, come back. But if I say, 'The arrows are beyond you,' then run, because that means the Lord is sending you away for your safety. And remember, the Lord is a witness between us forever." So David hid in the field. When the new moon feast came, Saul sat down to eat as usual. Jonathan got up, Abner sat by Saul, but David's seat was empty. Saul didn't say anything that day, thinking maybe David was ceremonially unclean. But the next day, when David was still missing, Saul asked Jonathan, "Why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal yesterday or today?" Jonathan replied, "David asked for permission to go to Bethlehem for a family sacrifice." Saul became furious and shouted at Jonathan, calling him names and accusing him of siding with David. He said, "As long as David lives, you will never be king. Send for him, and he must die." Jonathan asked, "Why? What has he done?" But Saul hurled a spear at him in anger, making it clear he was determined to kill David. Jonathan left the table in anger and grief, refusing to eat because of what his father had done to David. The next morning, Jonathan went to the field with a young boy, just as he had planned with David. He shot an arrow beyond the boy and shouted, "Isn't the arrow beyond you? Hurry! Don't wait!" The boy gathered the arrows and brought them back, not knowing what any of it meant. Jonathan gave his bow and arrows to the boy and told him to take them back to the city. Once the boy left, David came out from hiding. He bowed to Jonathan 3 times, and they hugged and wept together, deeply moved. Jonathan then said, "Go in peace. We have made a promise in the name of the Lord, saying the Lord will be between us and our descendants forever." Then David left, and Jonathan returned to the city. David arrived at Nob and went to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech was surprised and nervous to see David alone, and he asked why no one was with him. David, trying to protect himself and others, told a story. He said the king had sent him on a secret mission, and that he had arranged to meet his men somewhere else. He then asked the priest if there was any food he could have, 5 loaves of bread or anything that was available. Ahimelech said there was no regular bread, only the sacred bread that was usually set before the Lord, and he could only give it if the men had stayed away from women. David assured him that they had not been with women for the past 3 days, and that the men were ritually clean, so the priest gave him the holy bread, which had just been replaced with fresh bread in the tabernacle. Now, a man named Dog, an Edomite who worked for Saul, happened to be there that day. He saw all that happened. Then David asked Ahimelech if he had a sword or spear, saying he had left his own weapons behind, because the king's mission was urgent. Ahimelech told him the only weapon there was Goliath's sword, the very one David had taken when he defeated Goliath. It was wrapped in a cloth and stored behind the priest's garment. David gladly accepted it, saying there was no sword like it. David continued fleeing from Saul and went to Gath, where Achish was king. But the servants of Achish recognized him and said, "Isn't this the David they sing about?" the one who killed 10,000s? When David heard their words, he became very afraid. So, to protect himself, he pretended to be insane. He started acting strangely, scratching at the doors and letting spit run down his beard. When King Achish saw this, he told his servants, "Look at this man, he's clearly mad. Why bring him to me? Do I need more crazy people around me? Get him out of here." David escaped from Gath and went to hide in a cave called Adullam. When his brothers and the rest of his family heard about it, they came to him. Soon, many others who were troubled, in debt, or unhappy with their lives also joined David, and he became their leader. Around 400 men gathered around him. From there, David went to Mizpeh in Moab and asked the king of Moab if his parents could stay there safely, until he understood what God wanted him to do. The king agreed, and David's parents stayed in Moab while David remained in the stronghold. But then the prophet Gad came to David and told him not to stay there anymore. He advised David to return to the land of Judah, so David moved to the forest of Hereth. Meanwhile, Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. Saul was staying in Gibeah, sitting under a tree with his spear in hand and surrounded by his servants. He accused them all of betraying him. He said none of them had told him that his own son Jonathan had made a pact with David, and none of them cared about his feelings, or warned him that David might be planning against him. Then Doeg, the Edomite who worked for Saul, spoke up. He told Saul that he had seen David come to Nob and speak with Ahimelech the priest, who had prayed to God for him, given him food, and handed him Goliath's sword. Saul immediately sent for Ahimelech and all the priests of Nob. When they arrived, Saul questioned Ahimelech, accusing him of helping David and being part of a plot against the king. Ahimelech defended himself, saying David was one of Saul's most loyal servants, his son-in-law, and someone who had always followed orders. He said he didn't know anything about a plot and had simply done what he thought was right. But Saul refused to listen. He ordered that Ahimelech and all the priests be killed. The king's servants were horrified and refused to harm the priests of the Lord. So Saul commanded Doeg to do it. Doeg obeyed and killed 85 priests that day, all of them wearing the sacred linen ephod. Doeg didn't stop there. He went to the town of Nob and slaughtered everyone, men, women, children, babies, and even the animals. However, one of Ahimelech's sons, Abiathar, managed to escape and fled to David. Abiathar told David what had happened, how Saul had killed all the Lord's priests. David was deeply sorrowful and said, "I knew when I saw Doeg that he would tell Saul. This is my fault, my actions led to the death of your whole family." He then told Abiathar to stay with him and not be afraid, saying, "The man who wants to kill me also wants to kill you, but with me, you will be safe." When David heard that the Philistines were attacking the town of Keilah, and stealing grain from their threshing floors, he asked the Lord whether he should go and fight them. The Lord told him to go and save the people of Keilah. But David's men were afraid and said, "We're already in danger here in Judah. How can we face the armies of the Philistines in Keilah?" So David asked the Lord again, and the Lord assured him, "Go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hands." David and his men went and fought the Philistines, defeated them, took their cattle, and saved the people of Keilah. When Abiathar the priest fled to David, he brought with him the ephod, a priestly garment used to seek God's guidance. News reached Saul that David was now in Keilah. Saul thought, "God has delivered him into my hands, since he's trapped inside a walled city." So Saul called his army to march down and surround David in Keilah. But David learned of Saul's plan. He called for Abiathar and asked the Lord, "Will Saul really come to Keilah? Will the people here hand me over to him?" And the Lord said, "Yes, Saul will come, and yes, the people of Keilah will deliver you to him." So David and his 600 men left Keilah and moved from place to place. When Saul heard David had escaped, he gave up the plan. David stayed in the wilderness, hiding in mountain strongholds, in the area of Ziph. Saul searched for him every day, but God did not let Saul catch him. While David was in the forest at Ziph, Saul's son Jonathan came to him and encouraged him with faith in God. He told David not to be afraid, because Saul would not succeed in killing him. Jonathan said David would be king over Israel and that he would be by his side, something even Saul knew deep down. The two of them renewed their covenant of friendship before the Lord. Then Jonathan returned home while David stayed hidden in the forest. Later, the people of Ziph went to Saul and told him where David was hiding. They said he was in strongholds in the forest, in the hill country near Jeshimon. They invited Saul to come and promised to hand over David to him. Saul blessed them for their help, and told them to find out exactly where David was and who had seen him, because he was very clever in hiding. He asked them to find all his hiding places and report back so that Saul could come and search for him himself. The people of Ziph went ahead of Saul to locate David, but David and his men had already moved to the wilderness of Maon. Saul and his men went there to find him, and when David heard they were coming, he went deeper into the rocky areas. At one point, Saul and David were on opposite sides of the same mountain. David was trying to escape quickly because Saul and his men were closing in to surround and capture him. Just then, a messenger came to Saul with urgent news: the Philistines had invaded the land. So Saul broke off the chase and went to fight the Philistines instead. That place was later named Selahamelikoth, which means Rock of Escape. After that, David moved and stayed in the strongholds of En-gedi. After Saul returned from chasing the Philistines, he was told that David was hiding in the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul gathered 3,000 of Israel's best soldiers, and went to search for David among the rocky cliffs where wild goats lived. Along the way, Saul came to some sheep pens and went into a nearby cave to rest. He didn't know that David and his men were hiding deeper inside that very cave. David's men whispered to him, "This is the day the Lord spoke of. He has delivered your enemy into your hands. Do whatever you think is best." David quietly crept up and cut off a piece of Saul's robe without Saul noticing. But afterward, David's conscience bothered him. He felt guilty for even doing that much to a king. He told his men, "I must not do such a thing to my master. He is the Lord's anointed. I will not lift my hand against him." With these words, he held his men back and wouldn't let them harm Saul. After Saul left the cave and continued on his way, David came out and called after him, "My lord the king." When Saul turned around, David bowed down low to the ground to show respect. David then asked Saul, "Why do you listen to people who say I want to harm you? Today you saw with your own eyes how the Lord gave you into my hands in that cave. Some wanted me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not touch the Lord's anointed. Look, I have a piece of your robe in my hand. I could have harmed you, but I didn't. Let that prove I mean no harm. I have not sinned against you, but you are still trying to kill me. Let the Lord judge between us. May he deal with you as he sees fit, but I will not lay a hand on you. As the old saying goes, evil comes from evil people, but my hand will not be against you. Why are you chasing me? Who am I that the king of Israel should come after me like this, as if I were just a dead dog or a flea?" David continued, "Let the Lord judge between us. Let him see what is happening and defend me, and rescue me from your hand." When David finished speaking, Saul was moved. He called out, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And he began to weep. Saul said, "You are more righteous than I am. You have repaid me with good, though I treated you badly. Today you showed me kindness. The Lord gave me into your hands, but you didn't kill me. Who lets his enemy go when he has the chance to kill him? May the Lord reward you for what you did for me today. I now know for sure that you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be secure in your hands. Please promise me before the Lord that you will not kill my descendants or wipe out my family name." David made that promise to Saul. After that, Saul returned home, but David and his men didn't follow him. Instead, they returned to their stronghold, still cautious and watchful. After Samuel died, all of Israel gathered to mourn him, and bury him at his home in Ramah. Meanwhile, David moved down to the wilderness of Paran. At that time, there was a wealthy man named Nabal living in Maon, and his flocks were in Carmel. He owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing them. Nabal was harsh and evil in his dealings, but his wife Abigail was wise and beautiful. When David heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep, he sent 10 young men to greet him with a message of peace, reminding him that David's men had protected Nabal's shepherds in the wilderness. David humbly asked for any gift Nabal could give in return, especially on this festive occasion. But Nabal insulted David, questioning who he was, and refusing to give anything to men he considered strangers. When David's men returned with the insult, David became furious and told his men to prepare for battle. About 400 men went with David, while 200 stayed behind. Meanwhile, one of Nabal's servants told Abigail what happened. He explained how David's men had been kind and protective to them in the fields, like a wall around them. He warned her that disaster was coming, because Nabal was too stubborn and arrogant to listen to anyone. Abigail quickly acted, gathering a large amount of food, bread, wine, cooked sheep, grain, raisins, and figs, and sent it ahead with her servants, without telling Nabal. As she rode to meet David, he was already on his way, angry that his kindness had been repaid with insults. He had sworn to destroy Nabal's household by morning. When Abigail saw David, she got off her donkey and bowed before him. She begged him to let the blame fall on her, and pleaded with him to listen. She explained that her husband's name, Nabal, meant fool, and he had acted just as his name suggested. She reminded David that the Lord had kept him from shedding blood and taking revenge into his own hands. She spoke with great wisdom and insight, assuring David that the Lord would establish his house and protect him, and that one day he would be king. She asked David to remember her when that time came. David was deeply moved by her words and thanked God for sending her. He praised her wisdom, and said that her actions had stopped him from doing something he would later regret. He accepted her gifts and sent her back in peace. When Abigail returned home, Nabal was drunk and partying like a king, so she waited until the next morning to tell him what happened. When she did, Nabal's heart failed, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck him, and he died. When David heard of Nabal's death, he praised God for defending his cause and for keeping him from committing a violent act. He then sent a proposal to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. She humbly accepted, saying she would gladly be a servant to David's household. She quickly prepared and went with her maids to join David and became his wife. David also married another woman named Ahinoam from Jezreel, so both women became his wives. Meanwhile, Saul had taken David's wife Michal and given her to another man named Phalti, the son of Laish, from Gaulim. David heard once again that the Ziphites had gone to Saul, and told him where David was hiding, in the hill of Hachilah near Jeshimon. So Saul gathered 3,000 of his best soldiers, and went to the wilderness of Ziph to look for David. David saw that Saul was indeed coming, so he sent out spies to confirm it. Then he went to the place where Saul and his men were camped. Saul was lying asleep inside the camp, with his commander Abner beside him and soldiers all around. David quietly asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai, who would go with him into Saul's camp, and Abishai agreed. That night, the two of them snuck into the camp, and found Saul asleep with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abishai whispered that God had given David the perfect opportunity to kill Saul and offered to do it in one strike. But David refused, saying that no one should harm the Lord's anointed. He believed that Saul's death would come at the right time, by God's will, not by his hand. Instead, David told Abishai to take Saul's spear and his water jug, so they could prove they had been there. No one in the camp woke up because God had caused a deep sleep to fall on them. David and Abishai left safely and went to a distant hill. From there, David called out loudly to Abner, Saul's commander, and questioned how he could have let someone get that close to the king. He pointed out that someone had come to kill Saul, and Abner had failed to protect him. David then held up Saul's spear and water jug as proof. Saul recognized David's voice and called out to him. David asked why Saul continued to chase him like a common criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. He said that if it was God who had stirred Saul against him, then he would offer a sacrifice, but if it was people turning Saul's heart, they were cursed, for they had driven David away from his homeland and his place in God's inheritance. David humbly compared himself to a flea or a bird being hunted in the mountains. Saul admitted his fault and said he had sinned. He called David his son and promised not to harm him again, acknowledging that David had spared his life and acted righteously. David responded by asking Saul to send a young man to come and collect the spear. He reminded Saul that God rewards people for their righteousness and faithfulness, and said that just as he valued Saul's life, he prayed God would value and protect his own life from trouble. Saul blessed David, admitting that he would succeed and do great things. Then they parted ways. David went on his journey, and Saul returned home. David began to fear that eventually Saul would catch him and kill him, so he thought the safest thing to do was to escape to the land of the Philistines. He believed that if he left Israel completely, Saul would stop looking for him, and he would finally be safe. So David took his 600 men and crossed over to Achish, the king of Gath. They settled there, along with their families. David also brought his 2 wives. When Saul heard that David had fled to Gath, he stopped pursuing him. Later, David asked Achish for permission to live in a town outside the royal city, saying he didn't think it was right for him to live in the capital with the king. Achish agreed and gave him the town of Ziklag, and that town became associated with the kings of Judah from then on. David lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. During that time, David and his men made raids against the Jeshurites, Gezrites, and Amalekites, people who had lived in that region for a long time, even back to the days of the journey from Egypt. David attacked them completely, leaving no one alive, and took their livestock, camels, donkeys, clothes, and other belongings. Then he would return to Achish. When Achish asked where David had attacked, David would lie and say he had raided areas in southern Judah, or nearby territories that belonged to the Jerahmeelites or the Kenite. David made sure not to leave anyone alive, who could tell Achish the truth about where he had really gone, because he didn't want the Philistine king to know he was not actually attacking Israelite land. Achish believed David completely and thought that David had turned fully against Israel. He was convinced that David had made himself an enemy to his own people, and so Achish trusted him and thought David would serve him forever. During this time, the Philistines were preparing to fight against Israel, and Achish, the Philistine king, told David that he and his men must join the battle. David replied that Achish would soon see what he was capable of, and Achish promised to make David his personal bodyguard for life. Saul had previously removed all those who practiced witchcraft and sorcery from the land, but now, as the Philistine army gathered at Shunem, and Saul's forces assembled at Gilboa, Saul became terrified. He tried to ask God for guidance, but received no answer, not through dreams, not through the priestly Urim, nor through prophets. In desperation, Saul asked his servants to find a woman who could speak with spirits, and they told him about one in Endor. Saul disguised himself and visited her at night with 2 companions. He asked her to summon someone's spirit, but she was afraid because of the king's order to ban such practices. Saul assured her she would not be punished, and asked her to call up Samuel. When the woman saw the spirit, she cried out in shock, and realized the man before her was Saul. He told her not to be afraid and asked what she saw. She said she saw a divine figure rising from the earth, an old man in a robe. Saul recognized that it was Samuel, bowed down, and explained his fear. He said the Philistines were ready to attack and God had stopped speaking to him, so he was turning to Samuel for help. Samuel, speaking from beyond, told Saul that it was useless to ask him anything, because the Lord had left him and had become his enemy. Samuel reminded Saul that God had taken the kingdom from him, and given it to David, because Saul had disobeyed God's command to destroy Amalek. He then gave Saul a terrifying prophecy. The next day, Saul and his sons would die, and Israel would fall into the hands of the Philistines. Hearing this, Saul collapsed in fear and weakness, having not eaten all day or night. The woman saw how shaken he was and pleaded with him to eat something so he could regain his strength. Saul refused at first, but eventually gave in after his servants and the woman urged him. She quickly prepared a meal with a fattened calf and baked bread without yeast. She served the food to Saul and his men, and after they ate, they got up and left that night. As the Philistines gathered all their armies at Aphek, the Israelites set up their camp by a spring in Jezreel. The Philistine commanders marched in organized ranks, by hundreds and thousands, and David and his men followed, at the rear alongside King Achish. But when the other Philistine leaders saw David and his men, they were upset and questioned why Hebrews were joining them. Achish tried to defend David, saying he had been loyal since the day he joined him, and that he had never found anything wrong with him. But the Philistine princes didn't trust David. They insisted that he be sent back, fearing that during battle he might turn against them, to win back Saul's favor, perhaps by attacking Philistine soldiers. They remembered the songs people sang about him, how Saul killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. So Achish called David, and told him that although he personally trusted him and had seen no wrong in him, the other Philistine leaders didn't want him to join the battle. He advised David to return peacefully so he wouldn't upset the other rulers. David, confused and disappointed, asked what he had done wrong, and why he couldn't fight alongside Achish against their enemies. Achish again reassured him that he was seen as faithful, even comparing him to an angel of God, but emphasized that the decision of the Philistine lords was final. So Achish told David to rise early in the morning with his men and return. The next morning, David and his men left to go back to Philistine territory, while the Philistine army continued marching toward Jezreel. When David and his men returned to Ziklag on the 3rd day, they discovered that the Amalekites had raided the south and attacked their city. Ziklag had been burned, and all the women and children were taken captive, though no one had been killed. When David and his men saw the destruction and realized their families were gone, they wept until they had no strength left to cry. Even David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, had been captured. The men were so distressed that they spoke of stoning David, but David found strength by turning to the Lord. He asked the priest Abiathar to bring the ephod, and then David prayed, asking God whether he should chase after the Amalekites, and if he would be able to catch them. The Lord answered that he should pursue them, and promised that he would succeed and recover everything. So David set out with his 600 men. When they reached the brook Besor, 200 of the men were too exhausted to continue, so David went on with the remaining 400. Along the way, they found an Egyptian man who had been left behind by his Amalekite master, because he was sick. David's men gave him food and drink, and after he regained strength, he told them that he had been with the Amalekites when they raided the southern regions and burned Ziklag. David asked if he could lead them to the Amalekite camp, and the man agreed, on the condition that David would not kill him or hand him over to his master. When the man brought them to the camp, they found the Amalekites celebrating with all the stolen goods. David attacked them from twilight until the next evening, defeating them completely except for 400 young men who escaped on camels. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken, including his wives and all the people. Nothing was missing. He also took a large amount of livestock, declaring it as his spoil. When they returned to the 200 men who had stayed behind at the brook, some of the others who had fought in the battle argued that the ones who didn't fight shouldn't get any of the spoil, except their wives and children. But David rejected that idea, saying that the victory and blessings came from the Lord, and all should share alike. From that day on, it became a law in Israel that all would share equally. David then sent some of the spoil as gifts to the elders of Judah, and to various places where he and his men had previously traveled or stayed, such as Bethel, Ramoth, Jadar, and others, as a way of blessing and honoring those who had supported him. The battle between the Philistines and Israel grew fierce, and the men of Israel began to run away, falling dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines chased closely after Saul and his sons, and they killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting pressed hard against Saul, and he was badly wounded by enemy archers. Realizing that he was seriously injured, and didn't want to be captured and humiliated by the Philistines, Saul asked his armor-bearer to kill him with a sword. But the man was too afraid to do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it, ending his life. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died beside him. That day, Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died together. When the Israelites who lived on the other side of the valley and across the Jordan saw that the army had been defeated, and Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns and fled. The Philistines came and settled in those towns. The next day, the Philistines returned to the battlefield to strip the bodies, and they found Saul and his sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, took his armor, and sent word around their land, to celebrate in the temples of their idols and among their people. They placed his armor in the temple of Ashtaroth, and fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. But when the brave men of Jabesh heard what had been done to Saul, they traveled through the night, removed the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and brought them back to Jabesh. There they burned the bodies, then gathered the bones and buried them under a tree in Jabesh. The people fasted for 7 days in mourning and respect. If this story moved you, inspired you, or helped you understand God's Word better, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more engaging Bible stories.